How do you think history will remember these leaders?
Oh, I mean, as criminals, as war criminals, they are. They're complicit. There's no two ways about it. You cannot be sending weapons to Israel. You cannot be providing diplomatic and rhetorical support. There's definitely been a sense of, this idea of having the good Palestinian in the room. And often it's the Palestinian who has the British accent like me, and actually I think sometimes we internalize that as well, right? I've known a lot of people who just feel, if we get into the room with a politician and we say the right things and we're very kind and gentle and we don't raise our voices and we don't show anger about the fact that our people are being murdered day in, day out, but it's not working. That's the sad truth that's, we have to be stronger, we have to be unapologetic. But that's also why the BBC was established, right? We want to make sure that we are in those spaces and holding present and setting our own agendas as well, not being forced into frameworks that don't serve us, that push us on the defensive about things. There's a tendency always to need to legitimize our voices with an Israeli voice on a panel or this has to stop, because it's not helpful. And it's also, again, it's dehumanizing to suggest that we can't speak on behalf of our own needs and wants and rights.
Hello and welcome back to Palestine Deep Dive. My name is Ahmed Alnaouq, and today I'm joined by an amazing Palestinian British figure, Sara Husseini. Sara Husseini is a director of the British Palestinian Committee. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you for having me. Really, really good to be here with you.
Thank you very much. How are you today?
Oh, well, it's one of those questions that we know now is so difficult to answer as a Palestinian. But in general, I'm privileged and I'm happy to be here.
And you are from Al Husseini family.
I am.
I need to hear all about that.
I don't know what there is to hear. My dad's the Husseini. My mother's British. My father's side Husseini on one side, and his mother was a Khalidi as well, so another Jerusalem family. His grandfather actually was a gentleman named Hussein al-Khalidi, who was the mayor of Jerusalem in the 1930s and was actually exiled by the British during the British Mandate period as a method of quelling political resistance to British occupation, which obviously preceded the Israeli occupation and the foundation of the State of Israel. And what was really interesting actually about him is that while he was in exile, wrote a diary. He wrote a number of different works, mostly in Arabic, but he wrote a diary in English when he was in exile. And he would be listening to the radio and recording things and writing to the British government to make political demands, even from exile. He would listen to Prime Minister's questions and Foreign Office questions and comment on the fact that, the British leadership at the time was saying exactly the same thing from year to year. And it just always amazes me how that was in 1937. And now look, we're in 2024. And, it's very similar situation. Yeah.
And tell me more about your family in Jerusalem. When did your father move here?
So my dad was born on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem in 1952. His mother my grandfather and grandmother. My grandmother was from West Jerusalem, from the Qataman neighborhood. And she, in 1948, became a refugee effectively because Israel occupied and took West Jerusalem.
So your family is from West Jerusalem, not
my
East
grandmother's
Jerusalem.
side of the family from the West Jerusalem, and obviously the Husseini side from the family from East Jerusalem. So they moved to East Jerusalem, which is where the Husseini side of the family come from anyway. And he was born there, my dad. He, in 1967, so when Israel then occupied the rest of Palestine, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, he was outside in Jordan. The family I think his father had a job there. He was working, I think, with the World Health Organization at that point. And so they were outside. So they then couldn't come back to Jerusalem after 1967. And so the first time he actually went back to Palestine was in 1993 or 4, I think. And that was with a British passport that he had from having married my mother in the late 1970s. So he came over to the UK to study, to do a PhD in the late 1970s.
Your grandfather's family were from Jerusalem for hundreds of years. And then Israel came in 1967 and they took over Jerusalem. And then your father had to go back to Jerusalem only with a British passport.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so he was...
So as a Palestinian who has lands there or properties there, whose family lived there forever, he can't go there as a Palestinian. He needed to be a British citizen to go there.
And a tourist visa.
A tourist visa as well.
I mean, that's how you have to get in, right, with a British passport. So yeah.
It's very difficult to digest that. Although I'm a Palestinian, I know all of this. My grandfather's family were from Yafa, and my mother's family is from British Palestinian. And I know that as a Palestinian, I will never be able to go to Bir Saba or Yafa. So I understand this reality very well. But every time I hear that someone who is from Jerusalem, whose ancestors lived in Jerusalem forever, now need a British passport and a tourist visa to go and visit, it just blows my mind.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And just, the number of families who still have keys to their houses, like material objects from the place that they were born or raised, or their grandparents or their parents were, and that they have no ability to just go home.
I know. And even now, as a Palestinian from Gaza, even if I have a British passport, Israel will still deny me from entering Palestine because I have national identity number, which is Palestinian. So it's layers upon layers of dehumanization and depravity of rights. It's unbelievable. So tell me, as a British Palestinian who has links and family in Palestine, how has the last year been to you living here in the UK and watching the genocide in Gaza?
It's really hard to describe, I think. First of all, it's just been beyond belief, actually, to know what's happening in Gaza, to know. And obviously, you're so much closer to this than I am even. So as a diaspora Palestinian, I have this kind of sense of like knowing that I'm here and safe and privileged, and there's a lot of guilt that's associated with that. There's a lot of desire to do something, anything to try and stop the immediate urgent horrors that are taking place at the hands of the Israeli forces in Gaza. Also, elsewhere in Palestine as well. But I think in terms of actually being here in Britain, I think we already had a sense. We know that Britain bears a lot of historical responsibility and current responsibility for the genocide that's taking place now and everything associated with it. And it wasn't that it was a shock that British foreign policy or policy towards Palestine has not been where it should be, anywhere near where it should be over the past years. But I think there's something about the dehumanization and the erasure and the invisibility of Palestinians here that I hadn't fully appreciated. Just the idea that these people, these lives just don't matter. I think, again, also in Britain, we know that there is racism, right? There's structural racism in this country. But the depth of that, I think I didn't really understand until this past year. And I've lived most of my life here, so it's been quite a revelation in some ways.
For so many years, we have been criticizing the mainstream media, but here at Palestine Deep Dive, we are creating a platform, an alternative in which Palestinian voices are front and center. We are picking the questions, we are picking the guests, and we are leading the conversation. If you like what we do, please consider supporting Palestine Deep Dive. Become a monthly subscriber by donating as little as £1 a month. I know we understand that there is a lot of racism here in the UK, not only against the Palestinians, but what is striking for me is that what this genocide has proven us, Palestinians in the UK, is that the base of the British community is very pro-Palestine.
Yeah.
The majority of people here in the UK do support Palestine, but still we see a gap between the community in the UK and the parliament and the government's positions on Palestine. And I know that you are a part of your work in the British Palestine Committee is to engage with the parliament and sometimes the government. So how have you find this gap between the British government and the parliament and the British people?
Yeah. I think that's a really important sort of starting point in a way, because that is something that is massively there, right? We have a public opinion here in the UK, really strong solidarity movement. The people know better, right? And you've said this last year, we've seen, week on week, month on month, people turning out on the streets to protest against the killing of innocent people, against the genocide. We've had, polling 73% or so of people immediately against the ceasefire. The electoral results, even, right? The general election, we saw 5 independents voted in centering a Palestine platform. That's unprecedented in this country, to have that many people that voted in independently, and also for, of what's thought of as a foreign policy issue to be really central.
Yeah.
To a general election is also very, very unusual. So it really shows the strength of feeling that people have. But as you say, on the political level and the establishment level, the rhetoric is so far, not only far from public opinion, but really far from the reality. We're trapped still in this Oslo framing of conflict between two people with competing claims over land, as opposed to really understanding the root causes and the core of this, which began way before, even Israel was founded in 1948 with British occupation, British colonialism. And that acknowledgement is not there yet in the sort of elite circles. It really needs to be, because not just as a matter of historical fact, but if you don't understand the root causes of a problem, you have no hope of solving it. And that's what we've seen time and time again. Approaches, especially in the parliamentary space, which are limited. So they're either, we see at this point in time, obviously, a lot of humanitarian approaches. So the idea is that you divorce what's happening in Palestine from its political roots and causes, and you see it as a crisis, almost like we've had an earthquake in Gaza, or a natural disaster that's killed loads of people. And so all you're doing is putting in money and band-aids, and of course the humanitarian aid is really important. We have to do first and foremost everything we can for people to to survive, but to do that with completely divorced from any kind of political solution just means it's going to happen again. And we've seen it. You're from Gaza time and time again. How many times have you experienced war in your life as someone from Gaza? It's incredible. So yeah, there's and other approaches, economic peace approaches. So they're making a bit of a comeback, and I think we've just seen Trump re-elected in the US. His big deal of the century, that's all about, and the normalization of relations, the Abraham Accords, that's all about economic peace, right? That's all about, if we just make life bearable and a bit better for Palestinians, we just give them, they can have a house and a car and they can live, but we're not actually going to give them any national rights or collective rights or any kind of redress, any kind of justice for the oppression, the suffering that's been faced, then that's a solution that's never going to work. It's a partial solution. It's flawed. So yeah, I think there's a big gap and there's a lot to do, and that's kind of what we're trying to do at the BBC.
And I believe this gap is not because they don't understand the situation in Gaza or the lack of knowledge of what are the root causes of the problems in Palestine and the conflict. They know that very well. The UK has a historic responsibility towards the Palestinian people. They have been involved in this conflict since it started. But I think that the UK government and parliament do not take the Palestinians seriously. They don't care about the Palestinian suffering. Don't you think that is the case?
I mean, yeah, I think that's the only conclusion we can really come to, right? I mean, obviously we can't speak for the whole of every, MP in Parliament, every person. I think there are people out there, although, you say who don't know, but actually, even saying that, I'm correcting myself, because there is so much information out there that really, to not know is not really an excuse anymore. And I think you're right, political establishment, of course, there's history there and there's reasons, but the problem is there's also a massive contradiction and a massive double standard when it comes to Palestine compared to any other situation. And we see the government, doing this time and time again. Even if we look at this, the genocide of the past year, and we look at the government's position on genocide, we've seen even very recently, both Lammy and Starmer in the House of the Commons denying genocide point blank, refusing to call it a genocide, despite, the reams of, the ICJ case at the South African case at the ICJ, despite the Special Rapporteur's report coming out recently, despite a report that came out even this past week, all confirming alongside, numerous organisations that this is genocide. Actually, the fact that we've all been this has been live streamed. It's the first time in history that you've got something, Palestinians in Gaza are live streaming their own genocide. There's no excuse not to see this. And yet, interestingly, and when was it? October. So October 2023, November 2023. So 1 month into this genocide, the UK was part of a group of countries who put in an intervention on a case around genocide in Myanmar. And it was a 21-page detailed intervention that argued that actually a very expansive definition should be given to genocide, that if there's children involved, I don't know how many children now have been murdered in Palestine, but
over 20,000.
Right. So if there's children involved, You should lower the threshold for genocide. There were several paragraphs around denying medical aid, assistance diets, so starvation as a weapon of war. And you can do that in the same breath as deny the fact that this is happening in Palestine. I think that definitely speaks to your assessment that there's something here where Palestinians just simply don't really matter.
And David Lammy and Keir Starmer are international lawyers, they're human rights lawyers.
I mean,
so they know these definitions very well. And a few days ago, Keir Starmer said that he knows the definition of genocide very well, and that's why he's refusing to call it a genocide. How do you read this? Why does he do that?
I actually don't know the answer to that, really.
No one knows the answer. No one knows the answer.
Quite genuinely, I mean, you can talk about geopolitical realities, and you can talk about, but on a human level,
I expect a politician to talk about like politics and interests, but you are a human rights lawyer. Like human rights should be at the core of what you do, at the core of how you see things, how you judge things. And he doesn't really care about the Palestinians. Why? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I should have an answer to this, I feel like, but I don't know if at this point in time, given what's happened and how bad it is and how much we've seen and how much everyone can see, I think all I can say about this is it does feel, and maybe this is when I'm being hopeful, like it feels thin. And when I say thin, it feels like a lot of this narrative in the political establishment and the media establishment is so divorced from reality. And because the public can see that now, for example, like I've got family who are British family on my mum's side who understand a little bit about Palestine through having us as family, but aren't really that engaged. And even they, like, who would never have questioned mainstream media before, have come to me and just said, oh, well, that doesn't seem right, that I don't think that's true, or I saw this on social media. And so like it's what it feels to me like there's a sort of a clinging on by the political establishment and the media, the mainstream media that is, to this narrative that actually at some point when this is broken through, and I don't know when it is, I find a lot, I find myself a lot in this past year, like looking forward and trying to imagine, maybe it's a coping mechanism, but trying to imagine what it will look like to look back. And I do think there's going to come a time where everyone will look back and just be like, I was against genocide. Of course I was against the genocide. This is the most horrific thing that happened. It's going to be one of these atrocities in history that is, people will distance themselves from, no question. I believe fully and strongly that all of these politicians will say the same thing. The difference is that right now they're on the record and we know that. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know how they...
How do you think history will remember these leaders?
Oh, I mean, as criminals, as war criminals, they are. They're complicit. There's no two ways about it. You cannot be sending weapons to Israel. You cannot be providing diplomatic and rhetorical support. I mean, this line of self-defense this is the rhetoric that the politicians have been using from day one. This is self-defense, but bear in mind, in international law, we're talking about an occupied people and an occupier. So this is about the occupying power defending itself, and regardless, defending itself by killing at least 43,000 people, probably many, many more from all estimations of the people who are under the rubble, the people who have died from secondary causes as a result of the genocide. Like, no, I
Let's go back to your organization, the British Palestinian Committee. I know that there are many organizations in the UK here who are working on Palestine and Palestinian rights.
Yeah.
So tell me, why did you need to start this organization, the British Palestine Committee?
Yeah.
What does it offer?
I think the gap, so just to kind of give you a little bit of the background, this started out really as a voluntary network, started by a gentleman named Attallah Saeed, who was active in the Labour Party. And it was a network of British Palestinian citizens who were either policy people or lawyers or human rights people. And they saw this gap for Palestinian civil society and for Palestinians to be able to advocate on their own behalf, right? Which was very much, so what you'd find is, we have a very strong grassroots movement who are very clear about the core rights and the core demands of the Palestinian people as enshrined in international law. But they were not necessarily getting a hearing in policymaking circles. And then in policymaking circles, you have a number of organisations. Some are limited by their mandate, so they are a humanitarian charity, for example. And some working, but also, again, either not Palestinians themselves, which is, also important to have lots of different organizations, but maybe they were also working within some of these flawed frameworks, the ones we talked about, like working towards, just focusing on the humanitarian, or thinking of this as an issue of conflict management, and really feeding into policies that kind of serve to manage the situation rather than actually resolve it. But I think first and foremost, it was about allowing Palestinian civil society here in the UK and the diaspora, and Palestinians obviously who come to live here, to really have a voice and be able to speak on our own terms and set agendas our own way. And I think the other important thing is to say also not, two things really. There's one is, I think Palestinians often are brought into these spaces and asked to just talk about their experience, as in their lived experience, which is important, of course, but to tell people, what's happening to them and what they're witnessing, how they're feeling. But often we aren't seen as experts. We aren't seen, we have such a wealth of expertise in this country.
Exactly. It is always that there are some people who get to speak on behalf of the Palestinians in these circles. So do we have lobbying circles in Westminster, or who speaks on behalf of us right now?
Well, I guess there's the mission, which is the formal official PLO address of Palestinians, and there's other charities who bring in, who will bring in Palestinian voices, into spaces. There are organizations who are not even Palestinian who are taking up a lot of space, right? Who, will be claimed to be working on Israeli issues or whatever, which of course is, fine. So, you do what you do, but you shouldn't be speaking on behalf of Palestinians and the Palestine and Palestinian advocacy and Palestinian rights. So I think that's something. So I think it's about seeing Palestinians and understanding that we have expertise in these issues, as well as lived experience. So that's one thing.
Do you think that the Palestinians have the expertise to talk in these circles, in the parliament, in Westminster, in these political fields?
Yes, we have many professionals who have decades of experience of working as lawyers or as human rights people, or as in other fields that are not linked to Palestine, and then bringing that expertise. Before this, I was working in the PLO Negotiations Affairs Department for years.
Well, I know that very well.
Exactly, and I mean, look, I saw, I was there during the Kerry initiative in 2014. I saw how this works. I saw why Oslo failed and why the continued push for negotiations and things like that failed.
My question is that, since we, the Palestinians, we have expertise, we have people who can talk on behalf of the Palestinians very well, why are we always neglected in these circles?
Well, again, I think it's about probably not wanting to hear the reality of what's happening. It's also, like you say, there's just a dehumanization element of it. There's just a concept that we're not as important, and this is not exclusive to Palestinians, right? There are a number of marginalized communities, especially, and communities in the UK who have also suffered from the colonial legacy of Britain, right? Who are also not getting hearings. There's a problem in that in general. The other thing I was going to say about Palestinians in policymaking circles is also that it's really crucially important that when we go into these spaces and talk about Palestinian rights, and there are a lot of different people with a lot of different opinions, but this can't be about Sara's opinion or Ahmed's opinion or BPC's opinion. This has to be really rooted in core rights that are all enshrined in international law. It has to be rooted in core demands and the universal principles of justice and freedom and equality. It has to be rooted in the reality both of what's happened in the past and what's happened now. And this is often seen as, being somehow radical to come and talk about, the right to self-determination in real terms, and the right of return for refugees. But actually, I would argue it's very pragmatic to be listening to Palestine, to be listening to the people most impacted by this whole thing. It's a pragmatic step. You're not going to solve anything ever unless that is listened to, unless you are going back to the root causes, you are actually tackling them. And obviously, I think, in some ways people are avoiding doing that because they don't want to do that, right? In terms of political establishment, that's very real. But that's also why the BBC was established, right? We want to make sure that we are in those spaces and holding present and setting our own agendas as well, not being forced into frameworks that don't serve us, that push us on the defensive about things. There's a tendency always to need to legitimize our voices with an Israeli voice on a panel or in a... This has to stop because it's not helpful, and it's also, again, it's dehumanizing to suggest that we can't speak on behalf of our own needs and wants and rights.
A few days ago, I hosted Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, and she told me exactly the same. She said, unfortunately, in these circles, the Palestinians simply are not considered humans. Is that something you agree with?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't think it's that everybody in every room we go into in Parliament looks at us and thinks you're not a human being. I don't think that's fair, exactly. But I think what she's saying is right overall. I think it goes very deep, and I don't think people even realise it. Like I think, I'm trying to think of an example of the sort of dehumanization or the things that are taken for granted. So, for example, if you think about the number of articles in mainstream media that are published around, and it'll be an article, say, on anti-Semitism. But the photo that goes with the article will be a Palestinian flag at a protest.
Yeah.
You are actually, in that, you are saying that our national flag, our flag is inherently anti-Semitic, racist, and that in itself is a form of racism against Palestinians. But nobody really thinks about it, unless somebody complains about the piece, or, I mean, that's just one small example. But so, yeah, I think there is a definitely a sense of that. There's definitely been a sense of, this idea of having the good Palestinian in the room. And often it's the Palestinian who has the British accent, like me, or unfortunately that's the way
so
it is.
I'm not a good Palestinian.
Well, I'm not. Hey, I'm not talking for you.
It's true though.
But it's true, right? And actually, I think sometimes we internalize that as well, right? I've known a lot of people who just feel, like if we get into the room with a politician and we say the right things and we're very kind and gentle and we don't raise our voices and we don't show anger about the fact that our people are being murdered day in, day out.
You'll have to be the perfect,
and we only ask for very small things that we think they can do, and they, rather than actually asking them to do things that will actually materially change these things, like end arms sales or whatever. We play into that, and I understand why, because we're trying to persuade, but it's not working. That's the sad truth, that's we have to be stronger. We have to be unapologetic. We have to go in and speak to, and again, we've got everything. We've got, we've got the moral cause here. We've got the reams and decades of resolutions. We've got all the international law. We've got, the public opinion who understands that, and the politicians and in the media, the leaders of this country are ignoring that right now, but that we've got to make it so they can't ignore it forever.
But why? Why we, the Palestinians who've been under this colonization and occupation for decades, who've been genocide for over a year now, we always have to be perfect. We have to meet the expectations, and we always have to prove ourselves to be humans. Why do we have to be in this position at all?
Well, we shouldn't be. That's the point, right? It's not, and that's not a question. I think that's a question for us. It's a question for the people who are putting us in that position. I mean, I know from obviously an Israeli perspective, as in, the Israeli government who are perpetuating this genocide, and it's famously known that one of the steps towards genocide is dehumanization, because you have to make the people not seem like human beings so that you can get away and somehow justify killing them. And there's been a lot of that. There's obviously very strategic campaigns, narrative campaigns to do that, right, to us, which obviously people here, not people, but some.
Because usually you can't just justify the killing of children in tens of thousands and women and destroy the infrastructure and entire cities unless these people are not actually people, unless they're animals. And they succeeded in dehumanizing us, or they try to dehumanize us, not only the Israelis, but also politicians here, unfortunately. And there is another thing that Francesca said to me. She said the Palestinians are deemed to be ungrievable, When we die in tens of thousands, it's okay. It's okay. Palestinians can die in tens of thousands. But when the Israelis die, it's a huge thing. It's unbelievable. But talk to me a little bit about the Palestinian community here in the UK. Do you know how many Palestinians live in the UK?
It's an interesting question. I don't think anybody knows. We had a look at this. We've every so often we'll look and try and find data. There really isn't much data. I mean, some of that's to do with the fact that, a lot of Palestinians are stateless or have Jordanian citizenship, for example, like myself. There's no census category for Palestinian. They have Arab actually since 2021. That was a new category. So we will have a more sense now of how many Arabs there are generally in Britain. But Palestinians is quite difficult. We've been doing a little bit of work just to try and reach out and find community here. By way of, because I think one of the things we realised that the committee is, two things. One is that foreign policy and domestic policy are really tightly intertwined. And there's a diaspora community here who also have needs and demands that we want to reflect for policymakers in our political advocacy work. So we ran a civic needs assessment to see where the community is and what the main needs that are there. And of course, there are many emergency needs now because of what's been happening, particularly over the last year, but obviously for much longer. But more Palestinians arriving in Britain, needing immigration support, mental health support, all those kinds of things. Now, that's not something that we will do. We're not a service provider as BPC, but what we're trying to do is really help to put that infrastructure in place through organisations that already exist, in order to then help sort of have some kind of infrastructure. So so that Palestinians in the UK and in Britain can have some of the support networks that are in place needed, and that's also reflected in a policy guide that we're going to launch, or that we're launching this week.
Tell me more about this policy guide that you launched in the Parliament. So
it's effectively a framework for the new government, and we are looking at 3 key areas of recommendations. So the first one is around ending the genocide urgently, or actively and urgently working towards ending the genocide and Britain's complicity in that genocide. Then the second broad area is all around upholding the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. Namely,
what are these
namely self-determination, national sovereignty and return. And making sure we understand. So self-determination often gets mixed up with recognition of statehood. Actually, self-determination is about the right of Palestinians collectively to choose our future. And so that might be, and that could be 1 state, 2 states, whatever, but that's not something that should be imposed on us. And it's also not something that I can decide as Sara or you can decide as Ahmed. It's something we have to decide collectively. So self-determination gets narrowed quite a lot. So we want to make sure that that's understood, as well as, the right of return, which gets marginalised quite a lot. So, we're talking about UNRWA, for example, recently, a lot of the agency, that was set up in 1949 to help Palestinians in the wake of the Nakba, in the wake of, 700,000 people being forcibly exiled on, as that foundation of violence that created the state of Israel, basically. And so needing to UNRWA obviously has been under attack. And this isn't new, right? UNRWA has been under attack over and over again. It's by Israel. It's been defunded various times. The UK had defunded it. Now, that's one thing that has changed with this new government, is that there has been some restoration of funding to UNRWA. But there's a kind of an understanding that the agency is just a vital aid mechanism. And of course, it is a vital aid mechanism. And actually, if you think about it, the idea that the previous government stopped funding to UNRWA at a time of genocide when people needed their services more than ever, it is really it was an absolutely shameful move. But the thing that people forget about UNRWA is it's far more than an aid mechanism. It is about supporting Palestinian refugees and in their right to return to their homeland. And that, I think, gets lost an awful lot in modern kind of political discourse, especially in countries here like the UK. So I think making sure that that's reminded and on the agenda is important. Then the third category of recommendations that we've got are around defending the public realm here in the UK and protecting British Palestinians. So that's around things like we've talked about, like making sure there's not racism against Palestinians, making sure we're combating that, making sure Palestinians are free to speak about their lived experience, about their history without fear of being repressed or being shut down. That Palestinians in Britain who are coming, new arrivals from Gaza, have mechanisms to support them. One of those things being, like a family reunification scheme as well, so that people are supported until they can return. And again, that's really important. The return element of it is very, very important.
Tell me more about this family unification scheme.
I actually have a colleague who can tell you much more about it than I can, who's very involved in it. Effectively, there's a campaign that's separate to the BPC that's working on this. It's not a BPC project, but they are effectively asking for a visa scheme that would be similar to what the Ukrainians were offered, obviously since everything happened in Russia and Ukraine. And again, there's a whole point around that being a double standard, right? The reaction and the response to Ukraine and the response to Palestine have been, in absolutely, worlds apart, day and night. So that's really the ask of the family reunification scheme. But obviously, again, with the understanding that this is, there's a genocide happening, and number one is we need to preserve life, and if people can leave and preserve their lives, then that's absolutely the most important thing. With the understanding that they have to be able to go back if they want to go back, of course.
So the UK government had a scheme for Ukrainians who are fleeing the war in Ukraine, but they're not implementing the same scheme for the Palestinians.
Exactly.
Why do you think there is double standards here?
I mean, I think it's the same way there's double standards, we've talked about for Palestine in general.
Is it racism?
Yes.
Or something else?
No, there's definitely an element. Racism's part of it, of course. And then we know that because I think if you remember, I don't know if you remember when the war in Ukraine started, but there were media reports and things where people were saying, this isn't there was some woman who was talking about it. She was a reporter at the BBC, I think, in Ukraine, saying these people, this is not like some Middle Eastern conflict. These people look like us. They have blonde hair and blue eyes. It was some very, very overt racism around what was happening in Ukraine. So, that wasn't even connected to Palestine. So yeah, there's definitely an element of racism there.
We Palestinians in the UK need to have a space of our own to talk about our issues, the question of Palestine, to reclaim our narrative. And is that something that you do at British Palestinian Committee?
So that's one of the big aims, right? So I mean, we talked a bit about the policy guide and the actual policy recommendations. There are many, and our policy guide's covering only really a few of those, but there are many recommendations we can make. But actually, as important is having that space and being seen, so that policymakers can't say that they aren't hearing from us. They can't say that they aren't hearing this, or not, or not understanding this and what's happening in Palestine. And I think what's really interesting as well is the space to talk about these issues has been so shrunk and so repressed that you actually get a situation where even if we go into parliamentary and policy making spaces. Now, the government doesn't accept genocide, doesn't accept apartheid right now. Okay, let's take that. Let's say, fine, that's okay. You choose what you want to say about or how you want to position this. But the point is that even if you go in talking about these categories, there's such a reaction, like a visceral reaction to us using what are actually really weighty legal categories that have reams of evidence behind them, that have detailed reports, that have, UN after UN reports. Other countries, the other thing to say is that other countries, there's an international consensus around these things. And actually the UK, in taking up positions it's taking, is very, very much isolated from and isolating itself further. It's one of a handful of states continuing to put this wholesale support into an unconditional support into Israel. If we look at the ceasefire vote in the Security Council very early on, 13 out of 15 countries voted in favour of an immediate ceasefire. The two that didn't were the UK, who abstained, and the US, who vetoed it, and that was it. So we've gone, there's the things that we're talking to policymakers about, the categories, the legal terms we're using are not controversial, and yet they're treated that way. And the idea that even not being able to have the space to discuss and lay out these things, whether the government accepts them or doesn't accept them, has been a real problem. So we're trying to fix that element of the problem as well, I think.
Is that part of the British colonial project against the Palestinians, the erasure of the identity of the Palestinians in Palestine and the presence of the Palestinians in Palestine, but also here in the UK, where they don't want to listen to the Palestinians as we are invisible, as we don't exist. So when you go to the parliament and try to meet with these parliamentarians and talk to them, how is the reception you receive there?
So it depends, and it depends on the event and the MP but in general, as I say, it's there's always this sense that there's certain things that you can't talk about that you really should be able to talk about, and often conversations and things are shut down as being again radical when it's literally legal, really weighty legal evidence, or you never see people coming back who are opposed to the terms apartheid or genocide. They never come back with a legal rebuttal. They don't come back with a detailed report saying these are the reasons we think it's not genocide or it's not apartheid. They just shut it down, and often as anti-Semitic. That was how the apartheid report, if you remember, Amnesty International did an apartheid report that was, anything you saw that was against it was, this is anti-Semitic. Yeah. But there was no willingness to actually engage. There's never, because there isn't an argument, because we see the law and we see, how it works out. So that's on that point. I think the thing about the political discourse and this gap and the real divorce from reality of what's happening and the history is in part can only happen
Mm.
by making Palestinian voices invisible and Palestinians invisible here. And so the same way that settler colonialism seeks to erase or has sought over time, over a century or more, to erase Palestinians, actually here it's also seeking to erase Palestinian voices and to make sure that we're invisible, because then the problem doesn't need to be dealt with.
Yeah, and how hopeful are you that your policy guide will be listened to and respected
I
in the
mean,
UK government?
the real answer is I'm not hopeful at all. We've seen, we see, well, at least by the government, we've seen the positions. We know that the positions that we put forward are not going to be immediately accepted tomorrow. But nonetheless, I think it's important. I think it's important for MPs. There are a lot of new MPs in Parliament. The government itself is aware that this issue matters. The general election, yes, Labour won by a landslide, but if you dig into those numbers a little bit, it was really very shallow victory. There were so many near misses where Labour politicians were almost unseated because people were unhappy with them supporting a genocide. We've talked about the independents. The Green Party did far better than it normally does because Palestine was also centred as part of the platform. So there is a real electoral jeopardy there. There is for the first time, this issue has broken through to the sort of the party political machine and has dented this two-party system. Yes, it's very small. It's a tiny crack. It doesn't change anything right now. But I think the more that we can be in these spaces and speaking this truth, and based as it is on so much evidence and the universal rights, the principles that the Labour Party claims to avow as its own, the more we do that, and the more we actually, again, take presence, be in Parliament, be speaking, I don't think it's going to change anything overnight in any way, shape or form. But I think it's really important that we are there and we are doing it, because there's as Palestinians in general, this is not just the BPC, because we have to be heard, and we need to demand that we are heard.
Why do you think that being heard in the Parliament and in the government is very important for us Palestinians? Do you think it could help in the plight of the Palestinians?
I mean, alone, no. And I think that's really interesting, because that's one of the assumptions that we had to test when we set up the BPC. As I say, it was an informal voluntary network initially, with some brilliant people who would, every so often would meet with the foreign ministry, or they would write open letters as Palestinians jointly on really important issues. But there was this assumption, I think, that we had when we were then. So I came on board as a consultant initially, and we did a really whole sort of very in-depth strategic foundational process where we went out and we went to the rest of the movement. We consulted with different people. We wanted to make sure that there was that gap that we were looking to fill, and that nobody else was already doing it, because we definitely didn't want to reinvent the wheel, or so we went out and did this process. And one of the assumptions that we found we had to test was actually that if you get the access to policymakers, because of course, bear in mind, we don't even have that access a lot of the time. And that's actually a way that it's got much worse in the recent years, that just getting that access would change policy. That if we deliver good policy papers, we deliver good recommendations, that will change policy. We know that's not how it works. We know that this is a deeply hostile environment, that it's a very asymmetric situation. So no, it's not going to do that on its own, and that's why we do work in other areas as well as the BPC, and we also work really hard to make sure we're very much rooted in the movement. There are a number of amazing organisations, groups, people working in all the different spaces. Being really connected to that is the only way we're going to achieve anything. It has to be together, and it has to be a collective effort. It's never going to be one organisation or another that can fix everything. But we just feel that this was a space where we needed to be.
So is there any demand that you want to ask people who are watching you right now, whether they were organizations or individuals who just would like to help the Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, I think if organizations were always happy to be in touch and collaborate and understand what's out there, other efforts. There's so many initiatives that have either been there a long time or developed in the past year or so. So I think connections and sharing information is always really helpful. I think we're a very small organisation at the moment, and so we're going through a process now, thinking how we need to, develop a little bit to really cover this work that we've started doing well. So I think in that we'll be thinking about more ways to get people, involved or to support in some way. Yeah.
Sara Husseini, thank you very much for joining us today.
Ahmed, thank you so much for having me. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As Israel attempts to erase the Palestinian people under the cover of darkness, targeting journalists and censoring the press, we must rise from the ashes. At Palestine Deep Dive, we are building a multimedia space where our voices, the Palestinian voices, are always front and center. And right now, we just need 3,000 more of you to join our regular supporters and back our work so we can rapidly expand our output. Help us build the future of journalism. Become a supporter at PalestineDeepDive.com/support. This is 100% independent media powered by you.